I'm really
Okay.
sick right now. Hey everyone, we have Richard here. He's the CEO of Certus.One, and he'll be doing a talk on game theory and incentive mechanism design for miners. And I'll let him take it from here.
Hey everyone, how's everyone doing today? Yeah, thanks for joining. It's 6 p.m. on a Sunday, Pacific time. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So for this talk, what I wanted to do is to cover game theory and incentivized mechanism design for miners. Now, there's two types of mining groups. There's proof of work, proof of stake, and various other consensus mechanisms. And so this one, I'll just do a quick overview. It's not going to be a super technical talk, but it's not going to be dumbed down and easy to do. So I think it's going to be a very solid medium in between, and I hope you get a lot out of this talk. Okay, let's screen share here. View full screen. All right. So personal background, just for some context, I've been in crypto a very long time. I was on the original mailing list from cypherpunks. So I found out really much the day after it launched. I've been mining from the CPU days to the GPU days to the FPGAs to the ASICs. I've purchased, bought everything down the line from there. I've unfortunately been experienced and seen part of every major scam from back in the day. I've been Mt. Gox, I've been Finex, been all through all that. So I've seen really the ups and downs of crypto. And I'm going to drop some truth bombs this presentation. I kind of threw that in there. There's going to be some things in here that, you might find interesting. Quickly, just also about Certus.One. We're a validator company. One Cosmos is game of stakes. We do a bunch of run validators for various networks and also oracles. We work with a lot of funds, institutions. And lastly, I think for all the more hardcore people in this chat, we do play at DEF CON. So the hacking competition captures the flag. And Leo, our CTO, leads Team Germany, and they placed 7th last year. Okay, so when you think of crypto in general, I think it's a reflection of people, right? A community, a system is a reflection of people. So one of the things you have to really look at is the core human incentives. Now, there are generally, I know there might be a little controversial here, but there are generally two groups of people that have experienced being involved in crypto: speculators, and which are about 95% in my opinion, and philosophical, which is about 5%. Philosophical in a sense that they believe in decentralization. They're really advocates for it. They're advocates of privacy. They believe in the philosophy behind it. They're not really in it for the money. They just love the ideas of it. And honestly, that's a very rare small breed of people. The other part is understanding and designing different systems and incentives. So we'll cover that a little more, but it's really an overview of understanding how to look at these systems, how these incentives are created and why they work and how have they worked. Unfortunately, at its core, when you look at the core human incentives, the majority of these incentives and these designs are going to be driven by greed. Unfortunately, that's how it is. That's why, again, only 5% of people believe in the philosophical side. But majority of these decisions, whether it be yield farming, whether it be staking, whether it be any of these things, tokens are generally driven by greed. Also, crypto economic systems, well, I can even say monetary policy or economic policy, become really similar to real world case scenarios given long periods of time. So, for example, we generally, not all projects or not all protocols see this, but generally wealth becomes concentrated in the top 1% to 2%, just like the real world. And then, so one of the goals of that is to build and sustain a vibrant community, create the right incentives. So that's where the differences in the various protocols are, and is able to create these incentives and mechanisms in order to sustain a vibrant community where the wealth is not concentrated in the top 1%. So I think a good overview before going into a little deeper is just a general overview of like the mechanisms. These are not, albeit all of them, but I think it covers most of them. So some of these mechanisms, for example, perks incentives like STX app mining, I thought that was absolutely excellent. I wrote about that previously back in November of last year. Burning and decay, staking, inflation, and hybrid rewards, kind of like Blockstack's. We got insurance pools, slashing pools, liquidity pools. You got to take into account penalties and edge cases. When IBC starts working and we have full interoperability across multiple chains, you have to look at how the foundation economics are set up, how the grant systems are set up, and lastly, governance. Okay, so if you have questions, just please leave them in the chat. I can't see your questions as we speak, but at the end, I will leave time for the questions. Monetary flow. Okay, so how I look at these economic systems and how I look at the systems of these protocols is you have to, I think, really look at a monetary flow. And what I mean by that is how the money moves in and out of that system. Is it a closed system? Is it an open system? How does it flow? Is the flow the only, is there only one way to flow in? For example, the only way to get access to your ecosystem is to buy your token with fiat via Coinbase, or is there other ways for me to interact with your ecosystem? And so when you observe this and you really look at this, you have to look at where capital or where money or where value is coming in and where value, money, and all the other drivers are leaving. So that is, I think, key to understanding these types of incentive mechanisms. I'm always a big proponent of taking advantage of other systems that are already built, either through absorbing liquidity, capital, utility of some form. I like exactly what Blockstacks is doing, working with the Bitcoin protocol. I think it's fantastic. Instead of just depending on buyers of the token, take advantage of other product services. So whether it be oracles from other places, whether it be communication systems, databases, data storage, you want to absorb as much as you can. So because as you gain exposure, as your project or your company gets exposure to them, there's more people, there's more capital, more interest, more value flowing into your system. And so it's really different than a Web 2 company, where a Web 2 company is just a kind of a transaction, right? So you look at it's a revenue. So you're a customer, I'm company, I give you product, service, you give me money. Now we're talking a whole Web3. It's a very different economic system. And this is what gets me really excited about Web3. It is not, for me personally, the tech is cool. The tech will get there. Maybe right now we have a high gas price on ETH, but it will get there. But what I think is super interesting to me is the creation of this whole new economic system that has never really existed before. You see decentralized exchanges, like decentralized liquidity pools like Uniswap, are absolutely brilliant. I mean, it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant, I think, invention. Other thing to think about is retention versus acquisition. So a lot of the projects, a lot of companies are really focused on acquiring new users, either be through buy their token, either be getting a developer to build an app, either be getting an evangelist, whatever. But what I've noticed that have lacked a lot is actually focusing on retention, because the acquisition costs, if you look at digital marketing in general, the acquisition costs are significantly higher than retention. So I think, one of the key to decreasing monetary flow and working on your mechanisms is figuring out building retention-based systems and building positive feedback loops and retention-based systems. I think are very key. Lastly, I think is how will users adapt or revolt to changes in economic policy. So when I say economic policy, I think token economic policy primarily, but sometimes it could be governance policy or structural architectural policy. And what I've seen in the past is that there's always going to be people that are against it. And I think, and the thing that really drives the economic policy is going to come down to the core human instinct, which is greed, primarily greed. So, it's a very delicate line and it's very hard to navigate this, but I think understanding that this is the driver can really help you think about how to structure these changes in these governance decisions that are coming up. We've had quite a bit of experience with this because we run these sizable validators. We have institutions and funds that delegate tokens to us. And so they always ask us for advice like, hey, this is a policy or this is the economics of this protocol. They want to do this. What do you think? Now, these are investment funds, right? And they have a financial obligation to their investors. They have to return capital. And so their motivation is generally greed, or they need money to return to their investors. And so they always try to look at these things like the short term. Most people are more focused on the short term changes as opposed to more of the long term. And so we've had to navigate this quite a bit recently. It's kind of tricky. Okay, so we could start with kind of in the beginning, just quick background, there's in the beginning, it was a lot of philosophical based people that believe in the philosophy of crypto. Like you look at cypherpunks, you look at the, what's it called? The manifesto, the crypto manifesto. But unfortunately, even in the early days, you have all these believers that love these things. Unfortunately, a lot of it was still driven by greed. As a great example is Pirate Tag 40, which the guy I think believe went to prison. He ran this giant Ponzi scheme. I think at one point I was there, I was reading the forums, I didn't participate. I think he controlled at the time something like 40% of all Bitcoin available at the time. And it was Ponzi scheme, is paying out something like, I think like 7 to 10% per day. It was absolutely phenomenal. Same when you look at like other stories like Bitcoin Savings and Trust, Bitcoinica is another one. These are back in the day, right? So even early on, even with arguably the majority of the ecosystem, based on a philosophical basis, on a very early on, it was actually primarily, I think, it was driven by greed and speculation. Satoshi's initial design of a decentralized economic system is intended to give small players a chance to participate. It's not, it's not designed to, have a giant whale come in here, buy up like 30% of total supply at the initial supply and take it off. You try to focus on giving it to small players. And so that's why POW was so interesting, because it was based on computing power, CPU, and then eventually GPU. But it quickly got gamed. So that's something to think about. Is I guess there needs to be a term for this, but it's like rate of game, like probability of game or rate of game, and it was gamed by the FPGAs and eventually the ASICs. So the traditional hardware mining game. I think this is a very interesting just to look at this. I want to cover this because I think looking at the hardware mining times at the back in the day was a very good indication of how the game theory incentives really played out into the time now. I think a lot of these things, these tokens that are launched recently, I think there's not been enough time, or it's a really short data set. I mean, some of these launched, a few months. Like you can't have a good data set for that. And so what we see is, CPU to GPU to FPGA to base ASIC. There were a ton of failures. You see the big ones today, like Bitmain, but there were plenty of failures. China was not the first to the table. It was actually North American. I believe Butterfly Labs was the North American company. There was a very famous Swedish company that I bought. I actually visited their office really back, before then, and I bought a lot of their miners, so KNC Miner. And when they went bankrupt, they wrote this really compelling letter. It was a very interesting letter that basically stated why Bitcoin mining is going to be dominated by the Chinese. And it's a completely unfair playing field. It's headed for favor towards China. There's a lot of stories that I can, maybe share one here with you. And at the earlier days, even up to now, arguably now, it's a simple race to the bottom. It was a race to the fastest, most efficient chip and electricity/infrastructure cost. That's how it worked. If you guys were around during those days, you were paying attention to mining, it was wild. I could tell you a quick story about TSMC. So for example, TSMC, there was a company that I knew that was working with TSMC, which is Taiwan Semiconductor. They're pretty much the only company that could create ASICs or the chips for ASICs at the time. And they spent a lot of money, millions of dollars building this design for this ASIC. As they're going to tape out, which is when you basically build your wafers and your processors, they were contacted by, businesses in Asia generally operate differently than the West. They're contacted by another group, and this other group basically took those designs, taped them out themselves, and basically front ran all of their production by like 2 months. And back then it was a complete race, and got the product out 3 to 6 months before the original company did it. And the original company obviously didn't do very well because of that. And so they paid a lot of money, something like tens of millions of dollars to jump the queue, and they did this. So it was a very greed-driven economic system for ASICs, at least. Other part of this was a lot of stories that were mining with customer hardware. So a lot of these companies that built these ASICs, they're selling them for $5,000 each. But if you plug it in, it generates $3,000 per month. And so, what's the incentive there to really deliver these to consumers? And so what they did in the past too was, instead of selling them to consumers, they said, well, the production has been delayed, and we're just sitting here and we plug them into our data center and we start mining ourselves. And then when it becomes unprofitable, they ship them to their customers. Unfortunately, as a customer, you have no recourse of this, right? And back then they weren't taking credit cards. You can't dispute this. So they're taking crypto or so direct wires. And so what happens is back then was that even customers were receiving, you can completely tell these miners were used. They were covered in dust, or the fans were broken, or components were missing. You could tell these were used for very long periods of time. And so it kind of shows you the old school, kind of how the game of crypto mining really started out in the earlier days. It was dog eat dog. It was ruthless. It was brutal, and it was by the economic design of Bitcoin mining. Okay, so I think this we'll cover this a little more for the mining side. Is mining is really dominated by 4 core groups. Okay, at least over the years. Maybe now, if it's changed, it's just temporary. It's the first group is Chinese miner manufacturer. Okay, they're the biggest guys. They're the big ones. It's a long story about that. Second group is foreign governments. Third group is VC investor-backed companies. Fourth group is like me, mom and pop, self-funded miners that do it for fun. I bought like 5 machines. I want to do it for fun. I thought it was super interesting. I was super nerdy. That's a very small minority. And then you have to understand the incentives of each group, right? That's the key here. The Chinese mining manufacturer, they're primarily after profit. You've heard Bitmain, they tried to IPO at $14 billion valuation recently. They raised a bunch of money at $12 billion, I believe. And a lot of it is also power. So they're after, power in the regions. Foreign governments are a completely different group. They're a lot of times they're after currency controls and laundering. Laundering, not a sense of like, really like drug money and like that, but it's a little different laundry, which I'll explain later. And then the VC investors, they seek extreme profitability. They're not looking for a 5% return on their capital, not looking at 10% return on their capital. They're looking for multiples like 5x, 10x, 20x, 50x multiples. So they're in it for the speculation. The last one, mom and pop and self-funded miners, mostly generally for profit. Break even's fine, but a bunch of it is done by enthusiasts. But the enthusiast is sprinkled in because as you've been following the forums, like people run these in their house and they catch fire, or their wives tell them like, hey, you gotta stop doing this. The power company comes after them. Seen all of these stories. So when you're looking at these type of incentives, like you got to really think about your stakeholders. These are 4 different stakeholding groups, and think about how they interact with each other and observe their interactions and observe, what they do. What are their game plans? Okay, so I like to call it the maybe a little controversial, but I like to call it the hardware cartel. So Bitcoin mining hardware is essentially a cartel. This is a strong statement, but there are virtually no manufacturers of this hardware outside of China. The majority is owned by TSMC and a small portion by global foundries. How they win this game, how they have always won this game, how they win the mining, the hardware side, and they also win the mining pool side, is they have access to free, low-cost electricity in China, and the government actively subsidizes this at scale. So, for example, it's a story that a government or a private enterprise in China built a mining company, a mining facility, and they needed power. Well, if it was you and me in the United States or in Europe, we would have to pay for this electricity, we would source it. If we needed to build a facility, we'd pay for ourselves. They just get the local government, and they built essentially their own hydroelectric dam. And it was like a lease. There's basically free or negligible costs for the electricity. Secondly, they have 0 environmental regulations, no building codes, worker safety. If you've seen those videos on YouTube of like Bitcoin mining facilities back in the day, there's like a buzz you can hear from a mile away. It's absolutely terrible. But again, the key here is that it's a race to the bottom, right? Understanding the economic incentive that Bitcoin mining proof of work generally is a race to the bottom. And however you can do, whoever does it cheapest wins. That's how the incentive is built. The other one is money laundering, foreign reserves. Basically, so I can talk about this a little more. I've been asked this question quite a few times, and let me try to explain it a little better. It's that even if miners take a loss mining in China, in Iran, in other places with sanctions, for example, they don't care, because what they're doing is they're converting their local currency into USD or into Euro. So I can give an example of this. You're in China, and you set up a mining facility. You're paying your equipment, you're paying your facilities, you're paying your workers, you're paying your electricity in yuan, right? And then what you get in return is Bitcoin. Now, they do is they go to Hong Kong and they offload those Bitcoin for USD. That's what they do. So even if let's say the mining break-even point is $10,000 a Bitcoin, they don't mind paying 9,500. They don't mind paying. They don't mind if it's 9,000. They're getting less than the cost. They're taking a loss on the Bitcoin mining because they are circumventing the capital controls. So this kind of, if you think about this interaction here, it kind of skews the way mining is really set up. Right. So it's kind of unfair. And a lot of it is not just done by private. Like they, some people need to get money out of the country. And then they're like, okay, I know this guy that can convert it for you and convert it to Bitcoin for you. It just needs time. That's what it's done. And so essentially it's subsidized. And so, anyways, mining doesn't really generally has a very low barrier to entry. It does not require highly intelligent workers. So what I'm saying by this is not, you're not to be dumb to do mining, but you can hire somebody to run the mining facilities. It's not crazy expensive generally, unless you're running a tier 1 facility in the United States or Europe. That gets very expensive. But then again, you're not incentivized to run a tier 1 facility because the profits aren't there. So, and at the end is that the Bitcoin protocol primarily incentives a race to the bottom. The only exception is the foreign governments whose primary incentive is avoiding currency controls or bolstering foreign reserves. Again, that's key because what you see across these countries currently, or Venezuela, whatever countries is, their foreign reserves are drying out. So if you think about it, they're paying everyone locally, they're spending all their local dollars that are worth less or nobody wants it, and they're getting USD in return. That's a huge advantage. It's a huge trade-off. And that's why I'm not surprised. I've said this for years. I'm not surprised they're inventor. Like I was actually thought they would do this a lot earlier and do it even larger. Okay, so the next group of miners, what we call miners these days, is kind of, proof of stake / token sales / all the newer consensus mechanisms that are not proof of work. The original group of proof of work kind of changes now. It shifts. So, for example, it's large investors or whales or VCs or early investors instead of miners and manufacturers. They're generally focused on one region. For example, a lot of these projects are shut out from Asia. Or rather, Asia doesn't really have access to this deal flow, or if they do, it's too late by then. So they're just kind of generally more region. A lot of these ICOs, a lot of these sales structures are not very fair. I like to call fair. For example, there's no cap on investment and civil tax are very frequent. So let's say you're doing like you're doing like an ICO and you don't put a cap on the investment. One whale comes in here. We've seen this happen. Brave. You come in here and you put in you take like 80% of it and then no cap, and then everyone else is like it kills the entire community. When you have incentives like this, you got to understand, if you're raising capital and you're doing ICO, you need to understand this concept here. It kills your community if this happens. If one guy picks it up, or a group or a small group of people pick up tokens and everyone else is out of luck, the thing is that when you're trying to build a community, right from the very start, like they're very early, you're trying to build a community, you're trying to get people and trying to get people excited for your project. And from the get-go, it kind of screw them in some form, or they have the salty taste in their mouth from this token sale. You've lost those guys forever. I have seen this happen so many times where they just out of pure greed or out of just not understanding this, they just screw up the community from day one, and the recovery is a long and expensive path. And sometimes most of the times they don't recover. And so really think about this incentive structure investment and civil tax as well. You don't want some guy creating 10,000 accounts or writing scripts that go to the smart contract before everybody else, can increase gas or slow down the chain in order to get into these ICOs. We've seen that to attack the chains. So think about all of these things. You just want to make it. If you want to do an ICO, I say really encourage, do it fair. You want as many people to participate as possible, but you don't want it concentrated in 1% of people. That's how I generally what I think works best. A lot of it is almost entirely speculators. So when I look at projects, one of the people that was on earlier was Teller, which I thought was fantastic how they did it. And he's talking about speculators. I thought it was fantastic. I think it is truly almost all speculators. Very few people fundamentally follow the projects, and the people that do are going to be very active in the Telegram and the Discord channels. Make sure you communicate and hold on to them. I've seen projects set up like VIP groups or developer, I don't know, evangelist groups, or in our case, a lot of the team has put someone in charge of validators, and their sole goal is to communicate with all the validator teams and keeping them constantly updated and engaged. This is key. There's such a big difference between how companies communicate with their communities and their core stakeholders. And I can't tell you how important it is. So one thing also here to mention is that you have to understand your stakeholders. What we've seen is the large VCs generally don't care that much. Some do, but vast majority of them don't really care about your project that much. I can give an example. A VC has 100 investments. They have 120 hours a month. That's 1 hour, a little over 1 hour per month per investment. And so what we've seen is, these guys delegate their tokens to us. What we've seen is they'll actually ask the validator companies, like, hey, generally, sometimes they don't even know about the governance votes. Like, hey, what do you think of this? And usually the validator or whoever they're staking with, they usually tell them like, hey, this is probably the better decision. And so a lot of VCs are so detached after the initial investment that they don't even know there's going to be governance votes, and they own a sizable percentage of the tokens. So it's something to think about. And last one, small groups of highly concentrated token holders really lack community. So what is different, between the miners? We say proof of stake miners, or differently, is staking early yields larger rewards, higher inflation. So that's something that a lot of projects are really doing, is that they're offering outsized staking returns for the first 3 months to 1 year in order to basically bootstrap liquidity and bootstrap community. I think that generally works fairly well because it gets people excited. You have these competitions like Filecoin's competition that was large rewards, tons of participation, has a very high barrier to entry on computers. I looked into it significantly. It's pretty high, really high technical barrier to entry. We have games, competitions like Cosmos's Game of Stakes, Solana's Tortoise Soul, and these things are very interesting. This gets you basically at the early days, you need to recruit a core group of people that are excited about your protocol. And that is the key. And doing these things really helps. And if you're just a crypto enthusiast, I really encourage you to look at these projects and look at who their core community members are. The core community members will tell you a lot about the quality of the project as well. And also the difference between proof of stake and proof of work. One of the key things is the HODL factor generally has a higher expected return than proof of work, because what happens is that in proof of work, you have to, when you mine, you have to pay for your costs, right? You have to pay for your operational costs, your employees, your facilities, your electricity. So you're forced, most of them are forced to sell the tokens or forced to sell the Bitcoin in order to pay for their facilities. But in proof of stake or other chains that are similar, they don't have to do that. So they just hodl. Like, I think Polkadot launched. I think I just read that 54% of all dot holders or 54% of all liquid dots are being staked. I mean, that is phenomenal from week 1, not even day 3 or something, day 5. So, and so when you design a mechanism like a higher initial return for staking, you have a really strong hodl factor compared to proof of work. Okay. So the next part is, I think, a lot of questions here is DeFi mechanisms. Specifically, I think, covering a little bit more about yield farming. So what I think DeFi is, and it's kind of like how Wall Street is set up. It's actually kind of interesting if you study how Wall Street really took off, and how capital moves around the investment banks. It kind of reminds me of this a little bit. So DeFi, in essence, is, I like to say, it's a pot of cash that runs in circles trying to maximize manufacturer returns, textbook financial engineering. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, kind of like CDS and CDOs back in 2000, before 08. EM, YFI, CRV, Spaghetti, YFE, all these new ones. But what's really interesting is the new incentive structures that they have created. And using these iterations, and there's more iterations being built on it. I think that you see here is a new way of essentially bootstrapping early adoption. So what they're doing is they're using inflationary rewards to drive early adoption. So that's a very interesting incentive mechanism there. This is just relatively new. And so, if you look at the whole list of incentive mechanisms, I think this is a very interesting one. You should definitely take a close look at it if you're thinking of exploring these projects, being part of these communities, or just setting one up yourself. This one is more of the example I'm going to provide is more of you DeFi nerds. I know this one is a little harder to understand, but can you imagine a protocol with a token that governs a DeFi liquidity aggregation pool that holds tokens that generate yield by providing liquidity to a liquidity exchange governing a lending protocol and staking across 5 different assets, which one of them is STX, right? If you can really understand that, you're pretty damn good at DeFi. And something like this, for those who don't understand, if you just read about it more, you'll get a better idea. But this is where we're going. It's going to be kind of like credit default swaps and credit default obligations. There's going to be stacked, kind of stacked or intermingled exactly, right? And so for example, if you can understand this, think about how will the monetary flow be in the above example. How does the money flow back and forth? If you're an STX holder, how does this affect you, right? How does the Bitcoins earned affect you? Where does it go? How does it flow? Which token's gonna get the returns? Who's gonna do what? It gets very tricky. I think in a few years, as this space evolves, we're gonna see stuff like this. And I've always said you're gonna need a computer scientist with a master's in economics and financial engineering to be able to actually understand some of these assets. And where will the capital and users flock to? That's kind of the last part of this.
Hey, Richard, we're actually out of time.
Oh, sorry.
No worries.
Yeah, okay.
Do you think you can share the slides with the audience, maybe?
Yeah, we'll do that.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to transition to our next talk now. Thanks so much for this.
Okay, cool. All right, guys. Thanks.
Yeah.